vaccines, amen. The religion of vaccines, that and more. Aaron, welcome to the program.
Great to be here.
So, yeah, this idea, the idea of the book I love, because the fact that a theology has developed around vaccines and public health and infectious disease, where there's a canon, and the canon is what is accepted, and there are authorities on high that determine what the canon is, and those who step outside are sinners and need to be burned at the stake, and on and on and on. But did you imagine in 2019 you'd be writing a book like that?
No, I did not imagine I would ever write a book like that when I started my career 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. I would say it slowly started over the last 10 years, reaching a crescendo about 3 to 4 years ago. I was like, you know what, it's time to write this book. I spent a decade litigating against federal health agencies, deposing some of the world's leading vaccinologists, including the world's leading vaccinologist. And what I found along that journey is that there's what they tell the public, and then there's what they say under oath when they're in a deposition, when they're forced to say the truth on the stand. And then most critically, when you pin them to have to provide the proof for some statements that they make, and they can't provide it, or what they provide clearly doesn't support it. And so along that journey, I've come to realize most of what they say about vaccines is dogma beliefs, and I wanted to document it in the book at some point. Yeah.
And so what has happened to my profession? What is that? Is it academia running amok? Is it a centralized authority? I kind of feel like there's a philosophy that has captured public health that is, well, first of all, wrong. But secondly, if you dare step outside of it, you want to harm people. You are vilified for wishing harm on others.
I mean, I will say vaccines are unique, meaning I think that, large parts of the medical profession do wonderful things. You get into a car accident, you break some bones, you go to the emergency room, you're going to get treated, and you probably deserve a lot of praise for those doctors. I think vaccines fall into a very unique space just because of how the law and the policy and the money has started to flow in the area of vaccines versus all of other medicine. For every other medical product, whether it's drugs, med devices, you can hold the manufacturer accountable for the injuries caused by that product. What that means is that before it goes to market, they want to properly trial it. And then afterwards, they want to ensure it's safe because they want to not end up upside down, right? On the other hand, vaccines are the only product that have an immunity granted in 1986 under the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act that makes it so that no matter how much harm it causes to a child, even if it kills a child, you cannot sue the company to say, the pharma company to say, had you made that product safer, my kid wouldn't have died. My kid would have been injured. And so you've had 40 years of just an uncontested reign by pharmaceutical companies being able to influence the medical profession and to, I guess, various incantations. They are robustly trialed before they go on the market. Well, I lay out in chapter 10, every single trial for every single child vaccine. I make it fun. And you see, that's just not true. That's just dogma. Or there's robust safety after licensure. I go through that, through IOM reports and so forth in chapter 11. And then they all stop transmission. Not true. Everybody would die without them in America. Millions died before there was vaccines in America. I go through all of those hyperbolic claims. That's not to say that vaccines don't have any benefit. Obviously, measles vaccine, for example, can prevent transmission. Hence, it can, eliminate measles, which obviously would then reduce death. But that's not the end of the story. You got to look at the bigger picture if you really want to do public health right. And so until we actually stop, the medical profession stops repeating dogmatic claims about these products and starts actually thinking rather than believing in these products, we're not going to really be able to do public health well when it comes to vaccines.
Well, and the other thing that we heard Francis Collins say out loud is they gave no consideration to the negative impact of the decisions they were making. That was the most astonishing statement I've heard in my entire career. It is just, we just stopped the virus. We didn't care what we did along the way. It's like, oh my God. So let's flip over to that fiasco, the COVID fiasco. And let me posit something. let's just posit, and you tell me if this is a reasonable thing to posit. 2019, 2020, it's an emergency. It's a different illness than we have now. It's bad in some situations. It's 1-2% fatality rate. We can argue about what, but out of hundreds of millions of people, it's a lot of people. Great risk is taken. Far less safety measures are put into consideration. They don't have the data to support what they claim, but they bring it out to try to stop this beast. Let's just say that's true. I may be telling a complete fantasy, but let's say that's true. Why did they continue to mandate this same vaccine after it became clear that the threat was long gone? That's the part I can't reconcile. And not only did they continue to mandate the vaccine, but we knew well by that point that the vaccine was producing the pathogenic protein of the virus, the part that makes people sick. And why didn't we change course? Is it strictly that government can't? Or is it strictly the evil empire of profits? What do you think? Or is my construct completely out of line?
No, not out of line. I think it comes down to two things. Big picture. Obviously, you're asking a question from a very complex system, but I'll give two big pieces of it that I think provide a big part of the answer. First, okay, is that the government doesn't go and promote statins. The government doesn't go and promote other medical products. They don't go and promote cars. They don't go and promote planes. They don't go and promote any other consumer product in the way that they promote vaccines. And what does that do? Yeah. Does that conflict them? Does that let them sit in the seat of being a real regulator? Of course it conflicts them. Once they've gone out and government has wildly promoted these products, it then conflicts them from being able to say, oopsie, maybe we made a mistake in that regard. Because government rarely does mea culpas. Rarely does government say, we messed up. They don't do that. And government also engages in policy, not science. CDC thinks of, people think of the CDC as a medical organization. They're not. They're a government organization. They set a policy. Yeah, policy. And that policy is, for example, vaccines are safe and effective, and everybody should get them. And so everything they do then aligns with that policy. And so what does government do when they can't get their way by persuading you on the merits? What's the next stop on that train? Oh, a little coercion. Not enough? Throw your kids out of school. Not enough? Throw you out of your job. Not enough? Censor you on social media. That is what government does when it doesn't get its way, which is why we're not supposed to let government have those powers. That's why we should have individual and civil rights. And that's why, and I argue in my book, that the right to informed consent, the right to be able to say no to a medical intervention without any coercion is just as important as the right to free speech. It's as important as the right to assembly, religion. All these rights come with dangers, but the greater right is taking them away. And for every one of your viewers who maybe loves every vaccine and you love every mask and you want to wear 17 masks a day and live in your basement for stay-at-home orders, I support your right to do that. This is America. That's freedom. Right. But if the day ever comes when the government wants to mandate you to get something you don't want, and you can't go to school, and you can't get a job, and your kids can't go out, and you can't go to public transportation, then you're going to feel it. Then you're going to realize that ceding that right to the government was a mistake. And that's why I view the right to informed consent on par with all the other fundamental rights. Most, Canada, most of the provinces don't have vaccine mandates. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Canada, Australia,
Sweden,
Florida's going that way. Sweden, we should be a country where we persuade on the merits, not to take away people's rights.
3 out of 5 communist countries do not have mandates. China does not have mandates. 88 countries worldwide do not have mandates. Some of them do very well with vaccine uptake, nevertheless, but they protect the rights to bodily autonomy along the way. And we don't. We should be disgusted with our government. There should be pitchforks out. So that being true, what do we do with this?
Well, for the issue I just raised, we got to get government out of the business of these products, right? Which means we got to put we got to put liability back on the manufacturers. We have to get the FDA to act like regulators again, which I think they're on the path to do. Dr. McCary and Dr. Prasad are I believe on that journey where they stop promoting vaccines and start acting like regulators. Demand real clinical trials before they're licensed. Not the nonsense we see. I saw your clip beforehand about the hepatitis B vaccine. There's only 2 Hep B vaccines given to babies in the United States. One was licensed based on clinical trials of 5 days of monitoring on 147 kids and no control. The other one had 4 days of safety monitoring. That's ridiculous. Intuitively understand. You don't need to be an epidemiologist to know. And we have to get the CDC out of the business of vaccines and act as regulators again. Because at the end of the day, the reason your car, Dr. Drew, and all the products around you are safer, it's nothing to do with government, okay? Go back to the Soviet Union. You think products were safe back then and you had incredible government control. No, it has to do with economic self-interest. Companies need to have the economic self-interest to make their products safer. Here we have the worst of all worlds. We have companies without that economic self-interest. And then on top of it, government that's totally conflicted because they spend all the time promoting the products.
I also feel like something's wrong with public health. They should not have the authority they get under any circumstances. Can we do anything about that? Or does that require a constitutional amendment?
Well, at the federal level, most mandates for vaccines are at the state level. And so I have actually written a constitutional amendment. It's on icanlegislate.org that, we're working on getting on referendums in various states around the country that enshrine in state constitution the right to, never be coerced to take a medical product. People say like, well, what happens if there's a virus that kills 90% of people? Because that's where it always ends up. That's the conversation. And I say, hey, if you have a virus that kills 98% of people and you can't persuade them to take a vaccine in that situation, there must be a real problem with your vaccine.
That's right. And not only that, but the vast majority of the public health officials at the state level are pediatricians. They're not trained to make decisions on adult medicine. Next year, the national debt is going to hit $40 trillion. As insane as that sounds, it's even worse when you consider unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare. If our status as the world's reserve currency suddenly changes, our nation could collapse under the weight of its debt. And as we all know, there are many forces trying hard to take down that US dollar. This is why thousands of Americans are moving portions of their retirement into physical gold and silver. Our friends at Augusta Precious Metals have put together a 3-minute report entitled Debt Will Hit $40 Trillion in 2026. Prepare your retirement now. It details how a self-directed IRA with real physical assets may be the best option in 2025. Go to drdrew.com/gold. That is DRDREW.com/GOLD. Or text Drew, DREW, to 35052. That's 35052. And you'll get instant access to this crucial report. If you have $50,000 or more in your IRA, 401k, TSP, or other retirement accounts, consider our friends at Augusta Precious Metals to give you the information you need to make an informed decision about your retirement. It's fine to fight for our nation's future, but we all need to protect our own futures first. Read this important 3-minute report by visiting drdrew.com/gold. That is drdrew.com/GOLD, or text Drew to 35052 and see what Augusta can do for you. That was one of the first things that jumped out for me during COVID. It's like these people, they were freaking out about things that in adult medicine are not consequential. They're not a big deal. And so they were making the panicky decisions in an arena they have no experience. They're pediatricians. And because that's where the whole vaccine schedule comes in. Yeah, it's just, the whole thing is so whacked out. And I just hope we can get it organized. Let me talk again about the mandate from this. Go ahead, Aaron, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to take it a step further with the pediatricians because they shouldn't be respectfully making any decisions about vaccines. I've deposed the world's leading vaccinologists, immunologists, infectious disease doctors, pediatricians. With all due respect to pediatricians and what they do, when it comes to vaccines, I've never met one that knows almost anything about the products themselves, nor immunologists, nor infectious disease doctor, the ID doctors. The vaccinologists have some sense. But, making decisions about vaccines, like they were surprised that COVID vaccine that you inject in the arm to create a mucosal immunity doesn't stop transmission. That somehow was going to be a surprise to them. Well, they've never really read a vaccinology textbook then.
Right.
I'm sorry, but you were going to ask me something else.
Well, I can't wait to read it. I haven't read your book yet, but I can't wait to read it because it's going to arm me with everything I need to go to battle with these people because it's just such a crazy thing. And to me, one of the craziest sort of zones in this whole story. I mean, the biggest example of the lack of alignment between risk and reward would be a 20-year-old male college student who had to take the vaccine to go to school. That to me is sort of ground zero for liability. If you can incur it somehow. If you got myocarditis from a vaccine to go to school when you were 20 or 19 or 21, whatever it might be, there was zero probability of Omicron sending you anywhere. There was zero probability of the vaccine helping you prevent you from transmitting it to somebody else. And you only were at risk of the myocarditis. And yes, we can argue about whether it was 1% or 2% or 4% or 0.5%, 0% risk of hospitalization. So only risk for myocarditis for no good reason. And there should be huge lawsuits, it seems to me, for any kids that suffered as a result.
There should be, but you can't bring a lawsuit because of the PrEP Act. You can't sue the
and not against the school? The school? For maintaining the mandates?
So there's a lot of, so if they got the vaccine at the school, which a lot of them did in the school's health clinics and so forth, the school is also the administrator of the product, right? And then on top of it, if it's a complicated question, let me put it that way. But I think at the heart of the problem that you are describing is this: that analysis, the one you just did, Dr. Drew, a very reasonable analysis. Should that 20-year-old get it? Should they not get it? The problem wasn't, whether or not they should get it, shouldn't get it. The problem was that analysis, the ability to make that choice, was taken away from that 20-year-old.
Yes,
under the threat of exploring them from university. And what happens? And that goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. You asked him, what was the heart of the problem? The heart of the problem was the government making that choice for the public. That is the great danger. That is the problem. The government needs to get out of that business of making those decisions, because once they do and they get it wrong, and then you, Dr. Drew, go on and on social media and say differently, well, now they're going to want to censor you. Now they're going to want to, because you're bucking their policy, and they're going to deploy the massive armaments that government has against you, our own citizenry, and that's dangerous.
That's what we were all born witness to that. That's exactly what happened. And now we have all the evidence of how they did it too, through putting their hand on the scale with social media. My sort of concern these days is, how can we get some apologies out of some of these people with their excesses, and then where it need be, liability be brought to bear. And I thought schools might have some liability in all this, because they were, the government will say, we don't mandate things. The school mandated it. This kind of BS you hear out there.
In terms of accountability and as it stands right now for the COVID-19 vaccine, Secretary Kennedy could, with a stroke of a pen, lift the PrEP Act immunity. Now, that doesn't mean it would be retroactive, but it would at least be prospective. Okay. And so he's got the ability to do that on the PrEP Act. And because the COVID vaccine is not a routinely recommended childhood vaccine anymore, again, per Secretary Kennedy, it wouldn't be covered under the 1986 Act, the National Childhood Vaccine Act 1986. So you could finally go and bring claims for those injuries, but those would be that's would be what would really need to be happening first if you want real accountability.
I wonder, although we did eliminate this from the childhood schedule, and kids are dying everywhere, right? They're spreading the disease all over please give me a effing break. But okay. Why do we still have the PrEP Act? Sasha Latipova, I don't know if you know her, but she's very focused on that being a central issue. Why has that been maintained? Does anybody know?
Well, I'll give you two reasons. First, when the vaccines were procured...
And by the way, Aaron, I'm going to interrupt you. Explain to people what it is also. We jumped a little bit ahead, so go ahead.
Sure. So the PrEP Act is a federal law that provides that the Secretary of HHS can grant when there's an emergency, that at the discretion of the Secretary of HHS, if they declare an emergency, they can also grant immunity to any products developed to counteract that emergency. So if you go and you create a vaccine to counteract the emergency of COVID-19 vaccine, nobody can sue you if that vaccine causes an injury, no matter how unsafe, no matter pretty much anything you've done. So with a blank check, when you're developing those COVID-19 vaccine, when Pfizer was doing it, when Moderna was doing it, when J&J were doing it, they knew that their path to earn billions of dollars, any safety issues that they brought up was going to stop them from getting there. And they didn't have to worry about liability afterwards. That is what we were talking about earlier. That creates a horrible moral hazard and it inverts the normal economic incentives that assure safety. Now, that's what the PrEP Act is. So the PrEP Act was immunity was granted to them for any injuries from COVID-19 vaccine. And it's still in effect today, even though clearly there's no longer an emergency. And in fact, right before the Biden administration ended, that immunity was extended for numerous years into the future.
Yes.
Okay. Now, you said to me, why would they do that? First of all, when the COVID-19 vaccines were purchased by the federal government under various contracts, initially those are contracts actually with the U.S. Army. Okay, there was a provision in those contracts. I have copies, links to all those contracts in my Substack, so you can read them. That specifically says that these products would only be distributed while PrEP Act immunity applied effectively. So the federal government has contractually agreed that there would be PrEP Act immunity for the distribution of those products procured under those contracts. I've not looked at the more recent ones. So, has that changed? It's not exactly clear. Second but
Aaron, before you go on, before number two, yes. you're kind of heading back towards my original construct, which was there was an emergency. We had to get warp speed going. We had to figure out every way to get this thing done. Why does it continue? I still don't get it, but go ahead. If there's a contractual obligation, maybe that's why. And I also think at the end of the day, you've got 1,000+ pharmaceutical lobbyists down in DC that are pushing for its interests. I'm not aware of any registered vaccine injury lobbyist. And so they have a lot of outside influence, oversized influence, I should say. Pharmaceutical companies have a lot of resources and a lot of ability to impact elections and so forth. And so, why has the PrEP Act immunity not been lifted? I mean, at the end of the day, the White House would have to approve it. And why the White House hasn't approved it, that would be a question you'd have to ask Trump. And then the CICP compensation program, right? Is that something off the PrEP Act? And is that, go ahead, because I don't understand what that is. And I'm imagining it's pretty flimsy. Yeah.
I'm smiling because, that it's even called a compensation program. So, the CICP, which is the Countermeasure Injuries Compensation Program, is a product of the PrEP Act. So they didn't leave people with no recourse. They left people with virtually no recourse. Because if you're injured by a COVID-19 vaccine, you can file a claim with this program. Okay. Now, you fill out a piece of paper. Okay. You file it with an agency in the federal government. Who reviews it? You don't know. Who's the judge? Who's the jury? Who's the reviewer? You don't know. Yeah. What is the exact standard they're using? You don't know. Who's their experts? You don't know. Do you get to cross-examine them? You don't know. What's their actual process? You don't know. It's a black hole. I mean, it is the most ridiculous, it is the most violative due process program I've ever seen. And worse, you know how much money the whole program had last year? $7 million. And you know what most of that money was spent on? Their own personnel. So how are they going to compensate anybody anyway? New York Times or a reporter from one of these big, I forgot, New York Times or whatever, called me up because we have brought a lawsuit. We actually have 2 federal lawsuits, one still pending, where we are challenging the constitutionality of the CICP program. Our argument is simple. Hey, look, if this program does not violate procedural due process, forget substantive procedures, then that is meaningless under our U.S. Constitution. Okay? If you don't know your judges, you don't know deciding it.
Right.
So here's what I explained to this reporter when they called me. I said, look, let me explain to you what the CICP program is like. Go get a piece of paper, fill out what your injury is. Now go to your backyard, dig a hole in the ground, put the paper in the ground, cover it up, make sure you water it, make sure it gets sun, and wait for the compensation to grow.
Yeah. And it's not different than VAERS, by the way. I've sent reports into VAERS for very serious reactions. Never heard anything. Don't know if they got seen, who reviewed it, if they reviewed it. No way of knowing. But to be fair, it's the way the government deals with money, it seems like, too. So they've got a lot of things they need to sort of account for, and that they do no accounting of, or it's just astonishing. No checks and balances on anything. But what's ahead? What's in your crosshairs? What are you worried about? Where are you applying pressure presently? And what are you concerned about down the road?
Look, I mean, at the end of the day, my focus is about civil and individual rights. Vaccines are a product. They're not good. They're not bad. I'm not pro. I'm not anti them. I'm not pro car. I'm not anti car. I don't think cars are good or bad. If the gas tank blows up, we should fix it. And so at the end of the day, my focus is that everybody should be able to have a choice. Because here's who mandates impact. Mandates don't impact those who want to take the product. They're going to take it anyway. Most states in this country, about 45 of them, have basically checked the box exemptions. You can send your kid to school without a vaccine effectively, okay? I mean, some are religious, some also philosophical. Who do the mandates impact in the places where there was really no exemption, like California, New York, Connecticut, Maine? It impacts the parents, the families that have a real substantive reason to not take this product. That's who it impacts. Think about how pernicious that is, okay? Oh. And let me tell you, yes, there are some folks who are very vocal about vaccines out there who make a lot of noise and they get all the attention, okay? Some. But most of the folks who don't vaccinate, and we deal with tens of thousands of them at our firm, okay? Oftentimes, they don't want any attention. They're just folks who, their older kid got injured by X vaccine, or they had some other issue with another vaccine. And they don't, they've come to the decision that that their kid shouldn't get another one. They don't qualify for a medical exemption because that's not a medical decision. That's a CDC thing, right? And a strict table that includes virtually nothing. And I want you to just really think about this, okay? I think rare is the person that wakes up and says, you know what I want to do today? I want to take a socially ostracizing position that might get my kids kicked out of school, me kicked out of my job, my friends alienated, me called an anti-vaccine, anti-science quack, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. That's what, no. People don't come to that decision lightly. And when they do, there's usually a real reason for it. But yet that is who mandates impact. Those are the folks that I represent. Those are the folks that I see the heartbreak every day. Bad enough that you just injured one of their kids. Now you're going to kick them out of school on top of it. And when they go to try to seek medical care, don't say it's a vaccine injury, because you'll get treated differently than if you say it was from something else.
I'm excited to bring you a new product, a new supplement, Fatty. I take it. I make Susan take it. My whole family takes it. This comes out of, believe it or not, dolphin research. The Navy maintains a fleet of dolphins, and a brilliant veterinarian recognized that these dolphins sometimes developed a syndrome identical to our Alzheimer's disease. Those dolphins were deficient in a particular fatty acid. She replaced the fatty acid, and they didn't get the Alzheimer's. Humans have the same issue, and we are more deficient in this particular fatty acid than ever before. And a simple replacement of this fatty acid called C15 will help us prevent these syndromes. It's published in a recent journal called Metabolites. It's a new nutritional C15. Pentadecanoic acid, it's called. The deficiency that we are developing for C15 creates something called the cellular fragility syndrome. This is the first nutritional deficiency syndrome to be discovered in 75 years and may be affecting us in many ways, and as many as 1 in 3 of us. This is an important breakthrough. Take advantage of it. Go to fatty15.com/Dr. Drew to receive 15% off a 90-day starter kit subscription, or use code Dr. Drew at checkout for that 15% off, or just go to our website, drdrew.com/fatty15.
So the goal of writing my book was to try and show not that vaccines are bad, meaning to talk about the path ahead. But the path ahead in my mind is we need to get a critical mass of folks in this country to treat these products like products, to think about them, not believe in them. And the way we get there is for people to start understanding some of the substance that underlies these products, not to think they're bad or good, but just to kickstart the thinking. Because once we do that, we can then change how things happen in the courts and the legislative happens, and we can secure our rights when it comes to these products. Your body is the commodity on which pharma makes their profits. The more they can control it, the more money they can make. That's not a conspiracy. That's just good business. We need to push back on that.
How much is Maha changing all this?
As you could see, Secretary Kennedy has made a number of strides, and at every turn, he's been attacked viciously. He's reconstituted ACIP, that's the CDC's vaccine committee, with folks who are not just believers of vaccine, the folks who will think more. That the way there doesn't mean they're not all folks who are immediately going to say vaccine's bad. But he's got his work cut out for him. He has got his work cut out. He's got 65,000 career employees below him. And the closer they are to vaccines, the more zealots they are. I don't say that. I say that having gotten literally millions of pages of internal documents for FOIA requests to federal health agencies and seen exactly how they communicate internally. So he's got that below. And then he's got the White House, who's, I think wants to work with him to varying degrees above him that he still needs. So he's sandwiched, but he's making plenty of strides, and the wheels of government move slow.
Yeah, and those that are in that tens of thousands of ensconced bureaucracy have something that Joseph Fryman called irrational certitude, which is the opposite of the scientific method, which is rational uncertainty. We should, part of the very foundation of the scientific method is humbly keeping your open mind, updating your priors, checking your math, and constantly looking to ascend to an approximation of the truth, but knowing full well you'll never get to the truth, and always being ready to not just defend your position, but to update your position. And the scientific method, as Brett Weinstein has pointed out again and again, is a delicate instrument. We are not applying it properly anymore. We're not even training people in it. We're really not. I'll tell the story all the time. I'll just tell you really quickly. When I was going for my medical school interview in 1980, there was this doctor across from me, and he goes, at the very end of the interview, he goes, "What's the scientific method?" And I said, "Well, it's coming up with a good hypothesis, and designing an experiment to test that hypothesis, and do maybe a null hypothesis and a statistical analysis, like at least squares or something simple on it, and then repeat. And if that null hypothesis is informative repeatedly, then your hypothesis may ascend to something like a theory." And he was like, "I've been doing this work for 10 years. No one has ever been able to answer that question. What is the scientific method?" And that was 45 years ago. It's way worse now. It's concerning.
Completely. It's very concerning, and it's particularly concerning when the government gets involved. Harkening back to that again, because they don't engage in the scientific method; they engage in policy. It's the perversion of science. I'll give you one example that maybe make your head explode. Okay, so you know what the MMWR is? Probably that is the CDC's. A lot of people call it the CDC's medical journal or journal. It's not. It's their newsletter. That's what I call it. And it's a newsletter, but throughout my career, that was my relationship with the CDC. Reading the MMWR and just going, okay, what are your recommendations? What are you saying? What are recommendations? Fine, thank you. I'll take that into consideration. Never do this. That was never part of the CDC relationship. But that's because you assumed, rightfully so, you should have assumed that the MMWR engaged in the scientific method, because most of what's published there is then used to set policies, to take away rights, to set national policies about public health. So you were like, okay, all right, the MMWR is they're going through peer review, they're publishing everything, we're making sure. No, let me tell you how the MMWR works, okay? This is on the website, cited to my book, you can look at it yourself. First of all, it doesn't go through peer review, not that peer review is such a great process anyway, let's put that aside. It goes through an internal clearance process. And that clearance process has to assure, and I'm making this up, that the paper at issue aligns with the CDC policy. Think about that. It is not published if it doesn't align. The CDC's policy, for example, on vaccines is vaccines are safe and effective. So that creates what? Selection bias. The entire MMWR is a giant selection bias machine intended to kick out only things that align with policy. And I'll give you one real world example that I directly litigated with the CDC on. They said, well, those who've had vaccine, they can have their rights back. They can go to school. They can go to public. They don't, but those who haven't, you don't get your rights. I wrote to them and I said, well, what about those that have been infected already? Because by the time in 2021 this was going on, most people had been infected, even if they hadn't had the vaccine. And I cited to them 40 studies that all showed that natural immunity, or just what I call immunity, is better than vaccine immunity, artificial immunity, right? Because it tends to, at best, it's trying to mimic that natural infection. They multi-million person studies and so forth. They wrote back, they cited to one study, some ridiculous study the CDC did with a few hundred people. It was a case control study down in the South and they said, see, based on this study, we set our policy, which is the only one that found the opposite result, right? But that's what made it into the MWR. You can read that. We wrote them back. By the time we wrote them back after that, there was like 100 studies. It was 100 to 1. But it's not about the data. It's not about the science. It's about a policy. And that perverts the scientific method, as you told it. And it makes it very dangerous, particularly in this arena. Turns it really into almost a religion.
Well, you've made your case rather powerfully, and I'd like to leave it right there. And I can't wait to dig into the book so I can use your words to fight back on some of the excesses here. And again, the scariest part of this is, to me, not what a doctor and a patient and their family decide to do with vaccines. It's the government hand intruding into that relationship. And it's mind-boggling to me that I live in a country where that is allowed. I just can't even believe it, but here we are. Aaron, thank you so much. Where should people look for you?
I'm on X, Aaron Siri SG, which you said earlier. My law firm is SiriLLP.com. If you want to support our vaccine policy work, that's ICanDecide.org. Also have a Substack. And lately, I've been featured in a number of newspapers who keep attacking me, so you can find me there too.
All right. Thank you so much, Aaron. See you soon, I hope.
Ask Dr. Drew is produced by Caleb Nation and Susan Pinsky. Emily Barsh is our content producer.
As a reminder, the discussions here are not a substitute for medical care, diagnosis, or treatment. This show is intended for educational and informational purposes only. I am a licensed physician, but I am not a replacement for your personal doctor, and I am not practicing medicine here. Always remember that our understanding of medicine and science is constantly evolving. Though my opinion is based on the information that is available to me today, some of the contents of this show could be outdated in the future. Be sure to check with trusted resources in case any of the information has been updated since this was published. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, don't call me, call 911. If you're feeling hopeless or suicidal, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255. You can find more of my recommended organizations and helpful resources at drdrew.com/help.